The smell of industrial-grade bleach and cheap lemon-scented air freshener was my only companion for the first hour of my daughter's wedding reception. I sat at table 42, a lonely island of linen and silver tucked so far into the back corner of the grand ballroom at the Hawthorne estate that I could hear the rhythmic thud of the kitchen doors and the occasional flush of the men's restroom behind. Me. I checked my watch, a modest 20-year-old Seiko that had seen me through 3 decades of grading history papers in a drafty South Boston classroom. I was the father of the bride, yet I was sitting closer to the garbage bins than the head table. Every time the kitchen doors swung open, a gust of humid air carrying the scent of seared scallops and stressed-out catering staff hit the back of my neck. Across the sea of 500 guests, past the towering floral arrangements that cost more than my annual pension, I could see my daughter, Penelope. She looked like a dream in white silk, her hair pinned back with diamonds that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. Beside her sat Alistair Sterling, her new husband, a man whose family name was practically etched into the foundation of every skyscraper in the city. Alistair had looked me in the eye just before the ceremony, his smile as cold as a January morning on the Atlantic. "Arthur," he'd whispered, leaning in so only I could hear, "we had to move some things around. You understand, right? We have senators here, venture capitalists, people who expect a certain atmosphere. We thought you'd be more comfortable back here, away from the spotlight. Less pressure to keep up the act, you know." He'd patted my shoulder like I was a stray dog he was doing a favor for. I hadn't said a word. I'd just adjusted my charcoal suit, the one I'd spent $600 on, because Penelope said my old one made me look tragic, and walked to the back. I took a sip of my water. Not champagne. They hadn't even put a bottle on table 42. I was the only person sitting there, a deliberate signal to the rest of the room that I was the unguest, the person to be ignored. It was a far cry from the life I thought I'd built. I'd spent 37 years teaching at Benjamin Franklin High, walking the same cracked sidewalks, wearing the same tweed jackets, all so I could funnel every spare cent into Penelope and my son Julian's futures. I thought about the conversation 3 months ago, the one that should have warned me the ground was shifting beneath my feet. Penny and Julian had come to my small house in Southie, the one with the peeling paint and the porch that groaned under their expensive shoes. They didn't come for Sunday dinner. They came with a proposal. "Dad," Penny had said, her voice tight with that specific brand of anxiety she got when she was about to ask for a sacrifice. She was scrolling through her phone looking at photos of Beacon Hill brownstones. Alistair's parents, Harrison and Cordelia, they're old money, not just wealthy, Dad. They're influential. They think Alistair is marrying into a family of equal standing. I'd laughed, genuinely confused. Equal standing? Penny, they know I'm a retired teacher. They know your mother, God rest her, was a nurse. There's no shame in that. Julian had looked up from his Porsche key fob, his expression twisted in a sneer. "There is when you're trying to close a $10 million merger, Dad. Harrison is looking at me for a VP position at Sterling Global. If they find out you're just some guy who spent 40 years shouting about the Civil War to kids who didn't care, it makes us look common. It makes us a risk. So, we've come up with a story," Penny interrupted, leaning across my scratched kitchen table. "You weren't just a teacher. You were an educational policy consultant. You advised the district on multi-million-dollar budget allocations. You've retired early to focus on your private investments." I felt a coldness settle in my chest. "You want me to lie? To the people you're becoming family with?" "It's not lying, it's framing," Julian said, his voice smooth as silk. "And Dad, we need you to clear out the house for a bit. Alistair wants to bring his father by to meet you next week. We're going to rent some furniture. Maybe hide the clutter, the history books, the old photos." I'd looked at the walls, covered in pictures of them. Penny at her dance recitals, Julian at his graduation from a private college I'd worked 3 summer jobs to pay for. I'd given them everything. I'd cashed out my $401K to give Penny the down payment on her first condo. I'd taken out a personal loan to help Julian cover his startup costs for a tech company that folded in 6 months, a loan I was still paying off at $400 a month. "If you don't do this, Dad," Penny had said, her lower lip trembling in a way that used to break my heart, "the Sterlings might pull their support. Alistair might. He might think I've been dishonest with him. Do you want to ruin my chance at a real life?" I had conceded. I always did. I spent the next week living out of a suitcase in a motel while they scrubbed my life from my own home, replacing my soul with rented leather chairs and fake oil paintings. But it wasn't enough for them. Tonight was the proof. Even with the lies, Even with the consultant title they'd whispered to the guests, I was still an embarrassment. I was the Southie secret they were keeping in the shadows of the bathroom hallway. I watched Julian across the room. He was laughing with a group of men in three-piece suits, his arm draped over the back of a chair that probably cost more than my car. He hadn't looked my way once. Neither had Penny. I was a ghost at my own feast. A server walked by, carrying a tray of filet mignon. I signaled to him, but he looked at my table number, saw the 42, and kept walking toward the front of the room. The message was clear. Table 42 doesn't get served until the important people are finished. Is this seat taken? The voice was deep, gravelly, and carried the unmistakable weight of authority. I looked up, startled. Standing there was a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a portrait of a 19th century tycoon. His suit was black, but it was the kind of black that seemed to absorb the light around it, bespoke, perfect. His hair was silver, swept back from a face that was a map of hard-won battles and sharp intelligence. He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled out the chair next to me and sat down, placing a glass of neat bourbon on the table. I've spent 40 minutes trying to find a corner of this room that wasn't filled with the smell of desperation and fake smiles, the man said, looking directly at the kitchen doors. I think I've found it. I blinked, unsure how to respond. I think you found the poverty ward, sir. I'm not sure you want to be seen here. The man let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. He extended a hand. I'm Maxwell, but you can call me Max. And trust me, being seen is the least of my concerns. What's your name, friend? Arthur Miller. Well, Arthur, Max said, leaning back and taking a slow sip of his drink. Why don't we pretend we're old friends? It'll drive the people in the front of the room absolutely insane trying to figure out what a nobody like you is doing talking to a dinosaur like me. I looked at him, then back at the head table. I saw Julian mid-laugh, his eyes suddenly scanning the room. His gaze landed on our table. I saw the moment recognition hit him. His glass stopped halfway to his mouth. His face didn't just go pale, it went gray, like wet ash. He dropped his glass. I heard the faint shatter of crystal from across the room. Julian leaned over and urgently whispered into Alistair's ear, pointing toward us. Alistair turned, his smug expression instantly evaporating into a mask of pure terror. You seem to have a lot of fans, Max, I said, my heart starting to beat a little faster. Max didn't even look toward the head table. He just kept his eyes on me, a small, knowing smirk playing on his lips. They don't like me, Arthur. They're terrified of me. I own the debt that keeps the sterling name on those buildings, and I've been looking for an excuse to call it in. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. I didn't know the man I was looking for tonight would be sitting next to a restroom. But now that I've found you, I think it's time we changed the seating chart of this entire family, don't you? I looked at my son, who was now stumbling over his own feet to get to our table, and then at my daughter, whose eyes were wide with a sudden, sharp realization. I didn't know it yet, but the man in the black suit was about to give me the one thing I'd never had, the power to burn down the lies my children had built. So, Arthur, Max said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous kind of mischief, tell me about your private investments. I have a feeling they're about to become very, very public. I watched Julian's approach. He wasn't walking. He was vibrating with a frantic, stuttering energy that I hadn't seen since he was 10 years old, and I caught him trying to hotwire my lawnmower. Back then, it was mischief. Now, it was the raw, naked fear of a man who realized his house of cards was caught in a gale-force wind. He reached table 42 panting, his hand trembling as he reached out toward the table, then pulled it back as if the linen might burn him. Mr. Montgomery, Julian stammered, his voice 3 octaves higher than usual. We had no idea you were on the guest list. My apologies, sir. Truly, there must have been a clerical error with the seating. This table, this area, it's a staging zone for the staff. Maxwell, the man I now knew as a Montgomery, a name that carried the kind of weight that made the Sterlings look like lottery winners, didn't even look up. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the way the light from the kitchen hallway caught the ice. Arthur and I were just discussing his private investments. Julian, Max said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. He was telling me how he spent 30 years investing in human capital. It's a fascinating portfolio, high risk apparently, low yield on gratitude. Julian looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw the son I used to know. I saw the boy I'd taught to tie a tie in our cramped South Boston living room, but that boy was gone. replaced by this stranger in a $4,000 tuxedo who was currently looking at me with a mixture of pleading and venom. He wanted me to play along. He wanted me to be the consultant again. He wanted me to disappear so he could keep his lie alive. I didn't realize it then, but that look in his eyes was the final chord snapping. I had spent my entire life being the bridge my children walked across to get to a better life. I just hadn't realized that once they reached the other side, they intended to burn the bridge while I was still standing on it. To understand how I ended up at table 42, you have to understand the house on O'Malley Street. It was a narrow, 3-story salt box in Southie, inherited from my father, who'd worked the docks until his lungs gave out. When my wife, Martha, passed away 12 years ago, that house became my universe. I was a history teacher at Benjamin Franklin High, a job that doesn't make you rich, but it makes you useful. I knew every shopkeeper on the block. I knew which kids were going to make it and which ones needed a firm hand and a quiet talk after the bell rang. I was proud of that life, but as Penny and Julian grew, they began to see our world not as a community, but as a cage. "Dad, you can't wear those shoes to the gala," Penny had told me 2 years ago, when she first started dating Alistair. It was the first time I'd met his parents, Harrison and Cordelia Sterling, at a charity auction in the Seaport District. "People will think you're the janitor." I'd laughed it off at the time. "I've known the janitor at Franklin High for 20 years, Penny. He's a better man than most. Why would I care what they think?" But she hadn't laughed. She'd looked at me with a cold, clinical detachment that chilled me to the bone. "Because I care, Dad. I'm trying to build something here. I'm trying to be someone." I should have seen the warning signs then. I should have seen the way they started editing me. It started with the clothes, then the stories, then the house. 6 months ago, Julian had come to me with a business opportunity. He'd said he needed $50,000 to secure a partnership in a new wealth management firm. "It's the entry fee, Dad," he'd urged, sitting in my kitchen, refusing to touch the tea I'd made. "Once I'm in, I'm set. I'll be managing the Sterling accounts. I'll pay you back tenfold. You can finally move out of this neighborhood. You can get a place in the back bay. You won't have to worry about the roof leaking or the neighbors' loud music." I'd told him I didn't mind the roof or the music, but I saw the desperation in his eyes, the same desperation I saw now at the wedding. I'd gone to the bank the next day. I cashed out the remainder of my supplemental retirement fund. I gave him the money, not as an investment, but because he was my son and he'd told me he was drowning. I found out later, through a stray comment from Penny, that there was no entry fee. The $50,000 had gone toward a down payment on his Porsche and a membership at an elite social club where he could rub shoulders with men like Alistair Sterling. He hadn't been drowning, he'd been decorating. The tension at the wedding had been building for weeks, but it hit a fever pitch during the home inspection. That's what I called it in my head. A week before the wedding, Alistair's father, Harrison Sterling, had expressed a desire to see the Miller estate. Penny and Julian had panicked. They'd spent 48 hours transforming my Southie saltbox into a stage set. They'd moved my tattered recliner, the one Martha had bought me for our 20th anniversary, into the garage. They'd hidden my collection of first edition history texts behind a false wall of modern classics they'd bought by the yard from an estate liquidator. "Just for 2 hours, Dad," Penny had pleaded, her voice a frantic whisper as she straightened a designer rug over a permanent stain on the hardwood floor. "Harrison thinks you're an elite educational strategist. If he sees the truth, if he sees how we actually lived, he'll think we're social climbers. He hates new money, but he despises no money even more." I'd stood in the middle of my own living room, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. When Harrison Sterling arrived, he'd walked through my home like he was inspecting a stable. He'd poked at the walls, squinted at the rented art, and sat in a chair that didn't belong to me. "A modest footprint," Harrison had remarked, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a man who'd never known a day of hunger. "But I suppose a man of your strategic leanings prefers the understated approach. Tell me, Arthur, what's your take on the current vouchers in the private sector? I hear your firm was instrumental in the restructuring." I'd looked at Penny. She was nodding frantically, her eyes wide with terror. I looked at Julian, who was pouring Harrison a glass of 20-year-old scotch that I knew Julian had stolen from my own hidden cabinet. "I believe in the power of a solid foundation," I'd said, my voice thick with a disgust I couldn't entirely hide. "Whether it's in a classroom or a home, if the foundation is built on lies, the whole structure eventually collapses. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Sterling?" Harrison had chuckled, oblivious to the barb. "A philosopher. I like it. "Penelope, your father is a rare breed." They'd hustled him out shortly after, and the moment the door closed, Julian had turned on me. "You almost blew it. Built on lies? Really, Dad? Could you be more dramatic?" "It's the truth, Julian," I'd said, feeling a weary weight in my bones. "The truth is for people who can afford it," Julian snapped. "We're trying to survive." I had stayed quiet then. I had allowed them to finish the charade. I had even allowed them to pick out my wedding roll. I was to be the quiet, dignified father who stayed in the background. I didn't realize that background meant the service hallway next to the restrooms. Back at table 42, the present moment was catching up to the past. Alistair had joined Julian now. The groom looked like he wanted to faint. He kept darting his eyes toward the head table, where his parents were beginning to notice promotion. "Mr. Montgomery," Alistair said, his voice a frantic hiss. "Please, let us move you. We have a seat at the front, right next to Harrison." It was a terrible mistake by the wedding planner. She's new. She didn't recognize the name. Max Montgomery took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. He didn't look at Alistair. He looked at me. "What do you think, Arthur? Should I move? I'm quite enjoying the company back here. It's refreshing to talk to someone who doesn't smell like a hedge fund." I looked at Alistair, then at my son. They were both hovering, their futures practically vibrating in the air between us. If Max stayed here, it signaled to everyone in the room that the nobodies at the back were more important than the somebodies at the front. It would ruin the atmosphere Alistair had worked so hard to curate. It would expose the fact that they'd treated the most important man in the room and the father of the bride like trash. "I think Max should stay exactly where he is," I said, my voice gaining a strength that surprised even me. "After all, Alistair, you said it yourself. I'm more comfortable back here, away from the pressure. Why would we want to ruin that?" Alistair's jaw tightened. "Arthur, don't do this. Not tonight." "Do what, Alistair? Enjoy a drink with an old friend?" I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Julian stepped forward, his face twisted in a desperate sneer. "Dad, stop it. You don't even know who this is. You're embarrassing yourself." "You're just a teacher from Southie. Stop pretending you're—" He stopped abruptly, the words dying in his throat as Max Montgomery slowly stood up. Max wasn't a tall man, but in that moment, he seemed to tower over my son. "He's not just anything, you arrogant little pup," Max said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the wedding music. "And as for who I am, I'm the man who's going to be auditing Sterling Global on Monday morning. And I think I'll start by looking at the human capital expenditures, specifically the ones involving certain family investments." Max turned to me, ignoring the two men standing there like statues. "Arthur, I think we should go. This party is starting to feel a bit common, don't you think? I know a little place in the North End where the wine is real and the people are honest." I looked at my children. Penny had made her way over now, her face a mask of horror as she saw Max Montgomery standing at table 42. She looked at the restroom doors, then at me, then at the most powerful man in the city. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice small and broken. I stood up, smoothing my suit. I didn't feel like a ghost anymore. I felt like the man who'd spent 37 years teaching history, and I knew exactly how this chapter was going to end. "I'm going to get some dinner with my friend Penny," I said. "Enjoy your atmosphere. I'll see you when the foundation starts to crack." As we walked toward the exit, Max leaned in. "You handled that well, Arthur. But we're not just going for dinner. We're going to my office. I have some documents I think you'll find very interesting. Documents your son probably should have read before he signed them." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What documents, Max?" Max pushed open the heavy oak doors of the estate, the cool night air rushing in to meet us. "The ones that prove your son didn't just spend your money, Arthur. He spent money that wasn't his to spend, and he used your name to guarantee the debt." I froze on the steps of the grand estate. The world seemed to tilt. My son hadn't just lied about who I was. He had turned my life into a liability I didn't even know I owned. "What do you mean, my name?" I asked, the dread pooling in my stomach. Max looked at me with a grim, solemn expression. "I mean, Arthur, that as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, you don't just own a house in Southie. According to the paperwork Julian filed, you're the primary guarantor for a $3 million line of credit, and the Sterlings are about to call it in." The leather interior of Max Montgomery's car smelled like expensive cigars and old, settled power. It was a silent, suffocating contrast to the thumping bass of the wedding band still playing at the Hawthorne estate. Through the tinted glass, I watched the silhouettes of the grand mansion recede into the darkness of the Massachusetts countryside. My hands were locked in my lap, stiff as boards. $3 million. The number kept ricocheting around my skull like a pinball. I was a man who considered a $100 grocery bill a significant weekly expense. I lived on a pension that allowed for one nice meal out a month and a cable package that didn't include the premium movie channels. To me, $3 million wasn't just a number, it was an astronomical unit, a distance so vast it felt like another galaxy. "I know what you're thinking, Arthur," Max said, his voice cutting through the hum of the tires on the asphalt. "You're thinking about how a boy you raised in a house built on honesty could learn to forge a signature so well that a bank didn't blink." "I didn't say it was forged," I whispered, though my heart knew the truth. Max glanced at me, his eyes sharp even in the dim light of the dashboard. "We both know you didn't sign for a $3 million leveraged buyout of a failing textile firm in North Carolina, Arthur. You're a history teacher. You know that when people want to change their future, they often try to delete their past. Julian didn't just delete yours, he pawned it." I leaned my head against the cool glass. I wanted to go back, not to the wedding god, never back to that restroom hallway, but back to 2016, back to the small kitchen on O'Malley Street when Martha was still with us. Back then, the world made sense. We weren't rich, but we were Southie rich. We had a roof that didn't leak, a car that started most mornings, and 2 children who seemed to value the weight of a hard day's work. Julian had been the star athlete at Franklin High. I remember him coming home with grass-stained knees, his face glowing as he showed me a B+ on a chemistry exam he'd stayed up until 2 a.m. studying for. "I'm going to make you proud, Dad," he'd said then, sitting on the porch steps. "I'm going to get us out of this neighborhood. I'm going to buy Mom a house where she doesn't have to hear the neighbors fighting through the walls." He meant it then. I know he did. But Martha's death a year later changed the chemistry of our family. It was like the gravity that held us together simply vanished. Penny dove into her studies, fueled by a frantic need to escape the silence of our house. Julian, however, dove into the image of success. I didn't know it then, but the first red flag wasn't a lie, it was a pair of shoes. 6 months after the funeral, Julian came home for a weekend from his junior year at the university. He was wearing a pair of Italian leather loafers that must have cost $500. I was sitting at the table, balancing the checkbook, trying to figure out how to cover his tuition increase without dipping further into my meager savings. "Those are nice, Jules," I'd said, nodding at his feet. "Gift from a friend?" He didn't meet my eyes. He just buffed the toe against the back of his calf. "Investment, Dad. You have to look the part to get the internship. The guys I'm hanging out with now, they don't wear sneakers from the discount outlet." "The guys you're hanging out with have fathers who own the outlets, Julian," I'd warned. "Don't try to run a race you haven't entered yet." He just shrugged and walked upstairs, the sound of those expensive soles clicking on our old wooden stairs like a ticking clock. The editing of Arthur Miller had begun slowly. First, it was the suggestions. "Maybe don't mention you shop at the thrift store when my friends are around, Dad." Then, it was the subtractions. "I told Alistair's family you were a guest lecturer at Harvard, not a full-time teacher in Southie." It's basically the same thing, just sounds better. By the time Penny met Alistair Sterling, I was no longer a person to them. I was a draft of a character that they were desperately trying to rewrite before the final printing. "Max," I said, finally finding my voice as we pulled into the city. "How did Julian even get access to the documents? I haven't seen a bank paper in years." Max pulled the car to a stop in front of a sleek, glass-fronted building in the financial district. The sign above the door read Montgomery & Associates. "He didn't need you to see the papers, Arthur. Remember that digital security update he helped you with on your laptop last Christmas? He told you he was just helping you protect your identity from hackers?" I felt a sick lurch in my stomach. I remembered Julian sitting at my desk, his fingers flying across the keys. "Just one more click here, Dad. Give me your thumbprint on this scanner, it's just for the 2-factor authentication. Trust me, I'm the finance guy, remember?" I'd trusted him. He was my son. I'd given him my thumbprint, my digital signature, and the keys to my entire life, thinking he was protecting me. Instead, he was using me as a human shield. Bex led me through the silent, midnight halls of his office. We entered a room lined with mahogany bookshelves and a desk the size of a small boat. He pulled a thick manila folder from a drawer and slid it across the desk toward me. "Look at page 12, Max said. I opened the folder. My eyes blurred for a second, then sharpened. There it was. My name, Arthur J. Miller, printed in crisp black ink. Below it was a digital recreation of my signature, perfectly placed. The document was a personal guarantee for a $3.2 million loan issued to Sterling Miller Acquisitions, LLC. What is Sterling Miller? I asked, my voice trembling. It's a shell company, Max explained, leaning back. Owned 50% by Julian and 50% by Alistair Sterling. They used this money to buy into a high-risk tech merger that, as of 3 days ago, has completely flatlined. The money is gone, Arthur. The debt, however, is very much alive. I looked at the date. The loan had been finalized the day before the wedding. They used my name to get the money so they wouldn't have to risk the Sterling family assets. I realized, the horror dawning on me. Harrison Sterling didn't want his son's name on a risky bet, so they found a fall guy. They found me. Exactly, Max said. And here's the twist, Arthur. The Sterlings didn't just find a fall guy. They groomed one. Alistair didn't marry Penelope because he loved her. He married her because Julian promised him he had a father who was an educational policy consultant with secret millions tucked away in offshore accounts. Julian lied to the Sterlings to get in the door, and then he used you to pay the cover charge. I sat in the plush leather chair, feeling smaller than I ever had in my classroom. My children hadn't just hidden me in the restroom hallway because they were embarrassed. They'd hidden me there because if I'd talked to anyone, if I'd actually behaved like the man I was, the Sterlings would have realized I didn't have the millions Julian had promised. The restroom wasn't a seat of shame, it was a holding cell. Suddenly, the silence of the office was shattered by the vibrating hum of my phone. I pulled it out of my pocket. Julian. I looked at Max. He gestured for me to answer. I hit the speakerphone button. Dad? Dad? Are you there? Julian's voice was hysterical. I could hear the wind whistling in the background. He was outside, likely on the balcony of the estate. Where are you? Why did you leave with Montgomery? Do you have any idea what you've done? I think the question, Julian, is what you've done, I said, my voice surprisingly cold. Listen to me, Julian screamed. Whatever Max told you, he's exaggerating. He's a shark, Dad. He's trying to mess with the Sterlings by using you. You need to come back here right now. You need to tell Harrison that you authorized the signature. If you don't, the bank freezes the accounts tomorrow morning. Alistair will lose everything. Penny's marriage will be over before the cake is even cut. And my house? Julian? My pension? What happens to those when the bank realizes the tech merger failed? There was a long, jagged silence on the other end. We'll figure it out, Dad, Julian said, his voice dropping to a manipulative, soft tone. We're family. I'll take care of you. But right now, you have to protect us. If you don't sign a confirmatory affidavit tonight, they're going to call it fraud. Do you want your son to go to prison? Do you want your daughter to be a social pariah on her wedding night? I looked at Max. He was watching me with an unreadable expression. I'm not signing anything, Julian, I said. Dad, please. You don't understand the people I'm dealing with. Harrison Sterling will ruin me. He'll make sure I never work in this city again. Maybe you should have thought about that before you turned your father into a criminal's insurance policy, I said. I hung up. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. I looked at the folder on the desk. So what happens now, Max? I asked. Do I go to the police? Do I lose my home? Max leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. If you go to the police, Julian goes to jail and you spend the next 10 years in court trying to save your house. It's messy, it's slow. And in the end, the Sterlings walk away clean because they'll claim they were victims of Julian's fraud too. He tapped the manila folder, but there's a second option, a third way, one that Julian and Alistair didn't consider when they drafted this shell company. What's that? According to the fine print of the Sterling Miller Acquisitions, LLC, the primary guarantor, that's you, Arthur, has the right of emergency reversion. If the company falls below a certain liquidity threshold, the guarantor doesn't just owe the debt. He inherits the voting shares, all of them. I blinked. I don't understand. Max smiled, and for the first time I saw why the Sterlings were terrified of him. It means, Arthur, that because they failed so spectacularly, you don't just own the debt. As of midnight tonight, you own the company. And since that company holds the master lease on the Sterling family's flagship office building in the seaport, well, let's just say you're about to become your son-in-law's landlord. I felt a strange, cold shiver of realization. I wasn't just a fall guy. I was the one holding the fuse. But I don't know how to run a company, Max. I'm a teacher. I don't need you to run it, Arthur. I need you to dismantle it, Max said. But first we have to deal with the second part of the folder, the part Julian didn't tell Alistair. Max flipped to the very back of the folder and pulled out a single handwritten note. It wasn't on a bank form. It was on a piece of hotel stationery. Alistair, the old man, is tucked away. He won't be a problem. Once the merger clears, we'll move the liability to his secondary estate. He'll never even know the difference. P. I stared at the initial at the bottom. The P was looped in a way I'd seen 1,000 times on birthday cards and grocery lists. It wasn't just Julian. Penny, my sweet daughter, the girl I'd walked down the aisle just hours ago. She had been the one who told them exactly where to hide the bodies. What's the secondary estate? I asked, my voice cracking. Max looked at me with genuine pity. They didn't just use your name for the loan, Arthur. They used your wife's life insurance payout, the money you put in a trust for your future grandchildren. They've already spent it, and they were planning to blame the loss on your bad investments to cover their tracks. The room seemed to spin. My children hadn't just pawned my future. They had robbed their own mother's ghost. I didn't know it yet, I whispered to the empty room, but I was going to make them wish they'd left me in that restroom for the rest of my life. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. The thought of walking back into that stage-managed version of my life, sitting on a rented velvet chair that didn't belong to me, surrounded by books I'd never read, made my stomach churn. Max Montgomery, seeing the hollow look in my eyes, put me up in one of his company's private suites overlooking the harbor. I spent the night staring at the water. The harbor was black and restless, the lights of the cargo ships bobbing like distant, unattainable hopes. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that P at the bottom of the note. It was a neat, elegant little letter with a graceful loop that reminded me of the way Penny used to practice her penmanship at the kitchen table while I graded papers. I remembered one specific evening, years ago. Penny was 10. She'd looked up from her notebook and said, "Dad, when I'm a famous lawyer, I'm going to buy you a castle so you never have to worry about the radiator clanking again." I had laughed and kissed the top of her head, telling her that as long as I had her and Julian, I already lived in a palace. How do you reconcile that little girl with the woman who wrote, "The old man is tucked away. He won't be a problem"? The transition from loved father to problem to be managed must have happened gradually, a slow erosion of my humanity in their eyes, until I was just an obstacle between them and the sterling name. At 7 a.m. my phone began to scream, not just a call but a barrage of texts. Julian: "Dad, I'm at the house, where are you?" "The bank is calling. We need that affidavit now." Penny: "Dad, please, you're ruining my honeymoon. Alistair is furious. He thinks I lied to him about your cooperation. Don't do this to me." Julian: "If you don't show up in 30 minutes, I'm calling the police to report you missing. Don't be a child." Max walked into the suite at 7:15, carrying 2 cups of black coffee and a manila envelope. He looked as though he'd slept for 10 hours and had already won 3 lawsuits. "They're at your house, Arthur," Max said, handing me a cup. "Julian's Porsche is idling at the curb, and Penny is there in her wedding dress, her morning after outfit. They've even brought Harrison Sterling's personal attorney, a shark named Silas Vane. They're planning to corner you." "Let them wait," I said, my voice sounding older than I felt. "We aren't just letting them wait," Max corrected. "We're going to give them exactly what they want. A meeting. But we're doing it on our turf." An hour later, I was sitting in the back of Max's car as we pulled onto O'Malley Street. It was surreal. This was my neighborhood, the place where I'd lived for 40 years, yet it felt like I was visiting a foreign country. The neighbors were peeking through their curtains at the fleet of luxury cars parked on the narrow street. Julian was pacing my front porch, his suit jacket off, his tie loosened. Penny sat on the top step, her head in her hands. Next to them stood a man in a razor-sharp gray suit, Silas Vane. He looked like the kind of man who didn't have a heartbeat, just a series of cold calculations. When I stepped out of the car, Julian practically lunged at me. "Where the hell have you been?" he roared, his face flushed a deep, angry purple. "Do you have any idea the chaos you've caused? Silas here has been on the phone with the bank all morning trying to keep them from flagging the account for fraud." "Hello, Julian," I said, walking past him toward my front door. "Hello, Penelope." Penny looked up. Her eyes were red, but I couldn't tell if it was from crying or lack of sleep. "Dad, why are you doing this? It's my wedding weekend. You're supposed to be happy for me." "I am happy for you, Penny," I said, stopping at the door. "I'm happy that you've found a family that shares your values. It's just a shame those values don't include me." Enough with the theatrics, Arthur, Silas Vane said, stepping forward. His voice was like dry parchment. My client, Mr. Sterling, is very concerned. We have a document here, a confirmatory affidavit. It states that you were fully aware of the Sterling Miller acquisitions loan and that your digital signature was authorized. Sign it, and this all goes away. The Sterlings will even consider a generous stipend for your retirement. A bribe? I asked. A gesture of family goodwill, Vane countered. I looked at my children. They were watching me with a hunger that made me sick. They didn't want my love, they wanted my silence. They needed me to be the educational policy consultant one last time, to put the stamp of legitimacy on their theft. I have a better idea, I said. I pulled my keys out and unlocked the door. Let's go inside. I want to talk in my private office. We walked into the living room. It was still filled with the rented furniture, the fake oil paintings, the minimalist clutter they'd curated. It felt like a funeral home. Before I sign anything, I said, sitting in the rented leather chair that didn't fit the shape of my back, I want to talk about the secondary estate. The silence that hit the room was absolute. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Penny's face went from pale to ghostly white. She looked at Julian, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. What are you talking about? Penny stammered. The plan to move the liability to my wife's life insurance trust, I said, my voice steady. The money I set aside for the grandchildren I thought I might one day have. The money you've already spent to buy your way into the Sterling's good graces. Dad, that was a business move, Julian shouted, recovering his bluster. It was a bridge loan. We were going to replace it the second the merger went through. It was for the family. I am the family, Julian. I slammed my hand on the arm of the chair. The sound echoed through the sterile room. Your mother was the family. You didn't just steal from me. You stole from her. You treated her memory like a slush fund. Mr. Miller, Silas Vane interrupted, his tone patronizing. Emotional outbursts won't change the legal reality. The money has been moved. The loan is active. If you don't sign this, the bank will move to seize this property, this house, by the end of the business day. You'll be homeless, and your children will be in legal jeopardy. Is that really what you want? I looked at Max, who was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. You're right, Silas, I said, leaning back. The legal reality is what matters. And the reality is that Sterling Miller Acquisitions is currently in a state of technical insolvency. The tech merger failed. The $3 million line of credit has been fully drawn. And according to the terms of the master guarantee, I pulled a single sheet of paper from my jacket pocket, the one Max had given me that morning. The primary guarantor has the right to assume full management of the LLC and all its underlying assets to mitigate further loss. Max, would you like to explain the underlying assets? Max stepped into the room, his presence suddenly filling the space. Sterling Miller Acquisitions doesn't just own a failed tech stake. To make the company look attractive to the bank, Alistair Sterling folded in his personal holding company. That holding company owns the ground lease for the Sterling Global headquarters in the Seaport District. Julian's eyes went wide. What? No. Alistair would never put the headquarters on the line. Alistair was desperate, Julian, Max said. And he's not half as smart as he thinks he is. He signed the cross-collateralization agreement last month. He thought the merger was a sure thing. He thought he was using Arthur's name to get a free ride. I looked at Silas Vane. For the first time, the shark looked like he'd been hit by a harpoon. He snatched the paper from my hand, his eyes scanning the lines with frantic speed. This can't be right, Vane whispered. It is right, I said. And as the new managing member of Sterling Miller, my first act of mitigation is to cancel all executive bonuses and perks. That includes the lease on Julian's Porsche, the corporate credit cards used for Penny's honeymoon in the Maldives, and, oh yes, the office suite Alistair uses in the seaport. You can't do that, Penny shrieked. That's our life. You're destroying everything we worked for. You didn't work for it, Penny, I said, standing up. You stole it from a man you sat next to a restroom. You stole it from a woman who isn't here to defend herself. I walked toward the door, stopping in front of my son. He looked like he wanted to hit me, but he was too paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his world. The Sterlings are going to find out about this within the hour, I said. They're going to find out that the nobody from Southie now controls the roof over their heads, and when they realize it was you two who handed me the keys, Well, I imagine the atmosphere at the Sterling dinner table is going to get very, very cold. Dad, wait. Julian pleaded, reaching for my arm. We can fix this. We'll pay the trust back. Just sign the affidavit, and I'm done signing things for you, Julian, I said, shaking him off. From now on, if you want something from me, you're going to have to learn a word you've clearly forgotten. What word? Penny sobbed. I looked at them both. My children, the two biggest disappointments of my life. Accountability. As I walked out of the house, I heard the sound of Julian's Porsche screeching away. He was heading for the Sterlings, no doubt, trying to get ahead of the disaster, but I knew something he didn't. Max had already sent the formal notice of management change to Harrison Sterling's office 10 minutes ago. What's next, Arthur? Max asked as we got back into the car. I looked at the house on O'Malley Street. It looked small. It looked lonely. Next, I said. I want to see the look on Harrison Sterling's face when he realizes he has to pay rent to a history teacher. But as we drove away, a cold thought struck me. I had the leverage, yes, but I also knew the Sterlings. They weren't people who took defeat gracefully. They were predators, and a cornered predator is the most dangerous thing in the world. I didn't know it yet, but the fight for my life and the legacy of my wife was only just beginning. And the next move the Sterlings made would be far more brutal than a bad seat at a wedding. The Sterling Global headquarters was a jagged shard of blue glass and polished steel that pierced the skyline of the Seaport District, looking out over the water like a gargoyle guarding a hoard of stolen gold. To most people in Boston, it was a symbol of progress, of the new seaport. To me, as I stood in the I'd spent my life in rooms that smelled of floor wax and old chalk, where the most expensive thing was a second-hand overhead projector. Here, the air was filtered, pressurized, and scented with something called signature ambience. The floor was white marble, so polished I could see the exhausted lines around my eyes reflected at my feet. I wasn't wearing the rented charcoal suit today. Max had taken me to a tailor in the Back Bay on Sunday, a man who worked in a shop with no sign on the door and spoke in hushed tones about fabric weights. I was now wearing a navy wool suit that felt like a second skin. It didn't make me feel like a tycoon. It made me feel like a soldier putting on armor. Mr. Miller? A receptionist with hair pulled back so tight it looked painful stood behind a desk that was essentially a 5-ton block of obsidian. She didn't look at me like the janitor Penny was so afraid of. She looked at me with the wary respect reserved for a man who had just initiated a hostile management takeover of the ground lease beneath her feet. Mr. Sterling is expecting you in the solarium, top floor. I took the elevator up. The ride was so smooth I didn't even feel the movement, just a slight pressure in my ears as we ascended 40 stories. When the doors opened, I stepped out into a room that was entirely glass. Harrison Sterling was standing at the far end, his back to me, looking out at the harbor. My father used to say that the view from this floor was the only thing in the world that didn't have a price tag, Harrison said, his voice booming without him even trying. He turned around. He looked perfectly composed, not a hair out of place, but I noticed the way his fingers gripped his crystal water glass. He was wrong, of course. Everything has a price. I'm just trying to figure out yours, Arthur. I walked to the center of the room. I didn't sit. I didn't wait for an invitation. The price was paid 40 years ago, Harrison. It was called a life of honest work. Something you wouldn't know much about. Harrison chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. Honest work. You Southie guys love that phrase. It's the anthem of the mediocre. But let's put the class warfare aside for a moment. You've made a very clever move. Max Montgomery is a brilliant strategist, and he's used your unfortunate situation to create a very real headache for me. A headache? I asked. You're 3 months behind on the capital improvement taxes for this building. Taxes that were supposed to be paid by the shell company my son and your son created. Since they've defaulted, and I'm the guarantor, I've settled the debt with the city. Which means, according to the lease agreement, I now hold the deed to the land this glass tower sits on. Harrison's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned into chips of ice. For now. But you see, Arthur, this isn't a classroom. You can't just send me to detention. You're playing a game where the rules are written in disappearing ink. You think you have me cornered because of a lease? I have judges on my payroll who were at my wedding 30 years ago. I have bank presidents who owe their careers to my family. By the time we're done with the litigation, you'll be 90 years old and living in a cardboard box on the pier. I've lived in a house with a leaky roof for 12 years, Harrison, I said. A cardboard box wouldn't be much of a downgrade. But you? You've never even pumped your own gas. How do you think the board of directors is going to feel when they realize their grand visionary let a retired history teacher seize the family's crown jewel? The silence stretched between us, thick and ugly. Harrison walked toward me, stopping just inches away. I could smell his expensive cologne, something that smelled like sandalwood and arrogance. You think you're doing this for revenge, Harrison whispered. But look at what you're doing to your children. Julian is in a holding cell right now, Arthur. Did you know that? My heart stuttered. What? Oh yes. I had Silas Vane file a formal complaint this morning. Embezzlement, fraud, misuse of corporate funds. Since he's the one who moved the money from your wife's trust into the failed merger, the paper trail starts and ends with him. I can make that go away with one phone call. Or, I can let the district attorney have a field day with the Southie grifter who tried to steal from the Sterlings. I felt the air leave my lungs. This was the knife. Harrison wasn't fighting me for the building. He was using my son as a human shield. And Penelope, Harrison continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Alistair is already drafting the annulment papers. He's going to cite fraud and non-disclosure. She'll be out on the street with nothing but the clothes she wore to that tacky wedding. No settlement, no Sterling name, just the daughter of a man who burned down her life out of pride. They did this to themselves, Harrison, I said, though my voice lacked the steel it had moments ago. Did they? Or did you fail to teach them whatever values you're so proud of? Either way, here's the deal. You sign the ground lease back over to Sterling Global. You sign the affidavit saying you authorized the loan. In exchange, the charges against Julian are dropped, and I'll ensure Penelope gets a quiet, comfortable divorce settlement that keeps her in the lifestyle she's become accustomed to. He reached into his desk and pulled out a fountain pen. He laid it on the glass table between us. One signature, Arthur. Be the hero they always wanted you to be. Be the educational policy consultant who saves the day. Or be the man who watches his son go to MCI Cedar Junction and his daughter end up back in a Southie diner waiting tables. I looked at the pen. It was a beautiful thing, gold-plated and heavy. I thought about Julian in a cell. I thought about Penny, her dreams of being a Sterling turning into a nightmare. I didn't know it yet, but Harrison had just made his biggest mistake. He thought he was dealing with the man from the restroom hallway. He didn't realize he was dealing with a teacher who had spent 30 years watching bullies try to corner the quiet kids in the back of the room. I picked up the pen. Harrison exhaled, a triumphant little puff of air. Wise choice, Arthur. I knew you were a man of... I didn't sign. I held the pen up to the light, turning it slowly. You know, Harrison, in the 1920s, there was a man named Charles Ponzi right here in Boston. He thought he was the smartest man in the room, too. He thought he could move money around in circles forever, and no one would ever notice the hole in the middle. What are you talking about? Harrison snapped. I'm talking about the fact that I spent the last 4 hours with Max Montgomery and a forensic accountant from the SEC, I said. We didn't just look at the Sterling Miller loan, we looked at all of Sterling Global's secondary debt. You aren't just 3 months behind on the taxes for this building, Harrison. You're insolvent. You've been using the company's pension fund to cover your personal margin calls for the last 2 years. Harrison's face didn't go pale this time. It went a terrifying shade of crimson. You're lying. That's impossible. No one has access to those records. Max does, I said, because your chief financial officer is a woman named Sarah Kensington. Do you remember her? Probably not. You likely treated her like the furniture. But she was a student of mine in 1998. She was the one who helped Max find the hole in your books. The doors to the solarium swung open. Max Montgomery walked in, followed by 2 men in dark suits carrying briefcases. They didn't look like lawyers. They looked like the federal government. Harrison Sterling, the taller man said, flipping open a badge. I'm Special Agent Garrett from the SEC. We have a warrant for the seizure of all digital and physical records pertaining to Sterling Global and its subsidiaries. Harrison slumped into his chair. The transition was instant. He went from a titan of industry to a broken old man in a split second. He looked at me, his mouth working but no sound coming out. As for my son, I said, leaning over the table, my face inches from his. I already spoke to the DA. I handed them the note Penny wrote, the one about tucking the old man away. It proves that Julian wasn't the mastermind. It proves there was a conspiracy involving your son, Alistair. If Julian goes down, he's taking Alistair with him. They'll be cellmates. Dad? I turned. Penny and Julian were standing at the entrance to the solarium, led in by another agent. They were both in handcuffs. This wasn't the plan. I had expected them to be at the house. Why are they in cuffs? I asked, my heart hammering. Because, Max said, his voice grim. When the agents arrived at the Sterling estate this morning to serve the warrants, your son and daughter were caught trying to load 3 suitcases full of Alistair's mother's jewelry and $500,000 in cash into the back of a car. They weren't just victims, Arthur. They were trying to flee the country. I looked at Penny. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her wedding ring was gone. In its place was a smudge of dirt from where she'd been carrying the bags. "We were going to come back for you, Dad," Julian shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "We just needed to get clear of the Sterlings. They were going to blame us for everything." I walked over to them. I looked at the handcuffs, then at the children I had sacrificed my life for. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They hadn't been groomed by the Sterlings. They had been eager participants. They had seen the ship sinking and they had tried to rob the lifeboats before anyone else could get on. "You were going to leave me," I whispered. "You knew the bank was coming for the house on O'Malley Street today. You knew I'd be on the street, and you were heading for a private airfield." "It was Julian's idea," Penny sobbed. "He said you'd be fine. He said Max would take care of you." I stepped back. The room felt like it was spinning. All the effort, the legal maneuvering, the revenge, it all felt like ash in my mouth. I had won the war against the Sterlings, but I had lost the only thing that actually mattered. "I didn't know it yet," I said, my voice barely audible over the sound of the wind whipping against the glass tower. But the real betrayal wasn't the seat at the wedding. It was the fact that my children didn't just want me out of the way. They wanted me to be the only one who drowned while they sailed away on a stolen yacht. Max touched my shoulder. "Arthur, we have to go. The press is already downstairs." I looked one last time at the glass shard of a building. It was beautiful, cold, and entirely empty, just like the family I thought I had. "Let's go home, Max," I said. "I want to see my house before they take the rented furniture away. I want to sit in a chair that actually belongs to me." But as we walked toward the elevator, I saw Silas Vane, the Sterling attorney, whispering into a cell phone in the corner. He caught my eye and gave me a look that was pure, unadulterated malice. "You think this is over, Miller?" Vane mouthed. I didn't realize it then, but Harrison Sterling had one final investment that he hadn't told the SEC about. A silent partner who lived in the shadows of the Boston underworld. A man who didn't care about ground leases or SEC warrants. A man who only cared about the $10 million the Sterlings had just lost money that had belonged to him. And that man was already on his way to O'Malley Street. The silence of my house on O'Malley Street was heavy, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb the sound of my own breathing. Max had offered to stay, to send a security detail, but I had refused. I needed to stand in my own kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of the life I'd actually lived, before the Sterlings and my children turned it into a theatrical production. The staged furniture was still there, looking ridiculous and out of place against the peeling wallpaper of the hallway. I walked into the living room and grabbed the corner of one of those minimalist art pieces, a framed swirl of gray and beige that cost more than my first car, and ripped it off the wall. Behind it was the pale rectangle where a photo of Martha and me at the Jersey Shore used to hang. My children had tucked my entire history into cardboard boxes in the garage, like they were clearing out a hoarder's nest instead of a home. I sat down at the kitchen table. It was the only piece of furniture they hadn't replaced, mostly because Harrison Sterling had thought it looked quaint and shabby chic. I ran my fingers over a deep gouge in the wood where Julian had dropped a heavy trophy when he was 12. I'd spent my life protecting them from the world. I'd worked double shifts, tutored the most difficult kids in the district, and worn the same 3 coats for a decade just so they could have the best. And in return, they had used my identity as a burnt offering to the Sterlings. A heavy knock at the front door shook the house. It wasn't the polite, rhythmic rap of a neighbor. It was 3 slow, deliberate thuds that sounded like someone was checking the structural integrity of the oak. My heart hammered against my ribs. Max's warning about the Sterling's silent partner echoed in my mind. I walked to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I looked through the peephole. Standing on my porch was a man who looked like he was made of shadows and sharp edges. He wore a heavy leather duster despite the humidity, and his eyes were hidden behind dark glasses. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a federal agent. He was a shark of a different ocean. I opened the door 6 inches, the security chain still engaged. "Can I help you?" The man didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. "Arthur Miller, my name is Jax Blackwood. I believe your son, Julian, owes me a very large sum of money." $10 million to be exact. And since he's currently in a federal holding cell, I've come to talk to the guarantor. I don't know anything about $10 million, I said, my voice cracking. I'm working with the SEC. The sterling assets are being seized. Jax Blackwood leaned forward, his face inches from the gap in the door. I could smell cigarette smoke and something metallic like old copper. The SEC cares about balance sheets, Arthur. I care about my money. The Sterlings used $5 million of my capital to grease the wheels of that tech merger. Julian was supposed to move another 5 through a private ledger he kept in this house. He told me it was tucked away where no one would look, in his father's clutter. The clutter. The cardboard boxes in the garage. I don't have your money, I said, trying to close the door. Jax put a gloved hand on the wood, and the door didn't budge an inch. I think you do, Arthur. Or rather, I think you're sitting on the map that leads to it. I'll give you 24 hours to find that ledger. If I don't have it by tomorrow night, I'm not going to sue you. I'm going to start taking this house apart. And I'll start with the things you care about most. I hear your wife's jewelry is tucked away in one of those boxes, too. He stepped back, a cold, predatory smile playing on his lips. 24 hours, Arthur. Don't call your friend Max. Max Montgomery is a powerful man, but he doesn't operate in the dark. I do. He turned and walked down the steps, disappearing into the twilight of O'Malley Street. I leaned against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Julian hadn't just used me as a financial shield, he'd used my home as a vault for the mob. He knew the feds would never look through a retired teacher's garage. He'd hidden a $10 million death warrant in the middle of my memories. I didn't call Max. Jax was right, Max was a man of laws and courtrooms. This was something else. This was a street fight I wasn't prepared for. But as I stood there, a strange, cold clarity began to settle over me. I was a history teacher. I knew how empires fell. They didn't fall from external pressure. They fell because they rotted from the inside out. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the garage. The space was packed tight with the boxes Penny and Julian had shoved aside. I began to tear them open, tossing aside old textbooks, moth-eaten blankets, and cracked holiday ornaments. I found a box labeled MOM stuff. Inside were Martha's old nursing uniforms, her favorite tea set, and a small velvet box. I opened it. Her engagement ring, the one I'd saved for 3 years to buy. They hadn't even had the decency to keep it in the house. I kept digging. I found Julian's old baseball cards, Penny's high school yearbooks, and then, at the very bottom of a box marked old lesson plans, I found it. It was a black moleskin notebook, the elastic band stretched thin. I opened it. The first 10 pages were filled with my own handwriting notes for a lecture on the fall of Rome. But when I flipped to the middle, the handwriting changed. It was Julian's, sharp, slanted, and frantic. It wasn't just a ledger, it was a diary of a disaster. Julian had been keeping track of every cent he'd moved for the Sterlings and Jax Blackwood. He'd been skimming off the top, taking a 2% management fee that he hadn't told anyone about. That was where the money for the Porsche had come from. That was how Penny had paid for her designer wedding gown. They hadn't just been participants in the Sterling scheme, they were stealing from the thieves. But there was something else. A folded piece of paper fell out of the back of the notebook. It was a bank transfer receipt from a private bank in the Cayman Islands. The account wasn't in Julian's name. It wasn't in Alistair's. It was in mine. Arthur J. Miller. Julian hadn't just forged my signature on a loan. He'd opened a shadow account in my name and moved $4 million into it. He was planning to use me as the ultimate fall guy. If the merger succeeded, he'd take the money and disappear. If it failed, the feds would find a corrupt history teacher with $4 million in offshore accounts. The betrayal was so absolute it felt like a physical weight on my chest, crushing the air out of my lungs. I sank to the oil-stained floor of the garage, the notebook clutched in my hand. I thought about Penny at the wedding, whispering that I was too poor to sit with everyone else. She'd said that while she was wearing diamonds bought with money stolen in my name, she'd sat there and watched me be humiliated, knowing that if the hammer ever fell, it would fall on me, not her. I stayed in that garage for hours, the flashlight beam fading as the batteries died. I hit rock bottom. I was a man who had lived for his children, only to realize his children had spent their entire lives preparing to bury him alive. But as the first light of dawn began to creep under the garage door, the grief turned into something else. It turned into a hard, cold iron resolve. I wasn't going to be the victim anymore. I stood up, my knees popping, and walked back into the house. I made a pot of coffee, strong, bitter, and black. I sat at the kitchen table and laid out the notebook, the bank receipt, and the ground lease for the Sterling headquarters. I began to draft a new lesson plan. The Sterlings wanted their building back. Jax Blackwood wanted his $10 million. My children wanted their freedom. I was the only person who held the keys to all three. I picked up the phone and called Max Montgomery. "Arthur, are you okay? I've been trying to reach you all night." Max's voice was filled with concern. "I'm fine, Max," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "I found the ledger, and I found something else. I need you to do something for me. I need you to arrange a meeting, tomorrow morning, in the solarium of the Sterling building. I want Harrison Sterling, Alistair, Julian, and Penelope there, and Silas Vane. Arthur, they're in custody. The feds won't just let them out for a family reunion. Tell the DA that I have the location of the $4 million that went missing from the pension fund," I said. "Tell them I'll only reveal it if everyone is in that room. And Max, invite one more person. Tell him he'll get his money back if he shows up. His name is Jax Blackwood." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Arthur, what are you planning?" "I'm teaching a final exam, Max," I said, looking at the photo of Martha I'd put back on the kitchen counter. "And I have a feeling no one in that room is going to pass." I hung up and spent the rest of the day preparing. I went to the bank and withdrew the last $500 from my savings. I went to a local print shop and made several copies of the ledger. I went to the post office and mailed a heavy envelope to a reporter at the Boston Globe I'd met years ago. Then, I went to the cemetery. I sat by Martha's grave for a long time. "I'm sorry, Martha," I whispered to the grass. "I tried to raise them right. I really did. But they've got a sickness in them that I can't cure with a lecture. I have to let the world teach them now." I left a single white orchid on her stone, the same kind Penny had used at her wedding. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my old recliner, the one I'd dragged back from the garage, and watched the front door. I wasn't afraid of the shadows anymore. I was the one waiting in the dark. I didn't know it yet, but the nobody from Southie was about to orchestrate the most spectacular collapse in the history of the Sterling family. And when the dust settled, the only thing left standing would be the truth I'd spent 30 years trying to hide from myself. The revenge wasn't just for the seat by the restroom. It was for the 30 years I'd spent being a father to ghosts. The solarium of the Sterling building was flooded with the kind of blinding, high-altitude sunlight that makes everything look a little too sharp, a little too real. It was 10 in the morning, and the city of Boston stretched out below us like a circuit board. To anyone else, it was a view of triumph. To the people gathered in this room, it was a view of the long way down. I stood by the window, the navy wool of my new suit feeling like a heavy weight. I wasn't looking at the harbor. I was looking at the reflection in the glass. There they were, the architects of my misery. Harrison Sterling sat in his high-backed leather chair, looking like a king whose palace was being looted while he watched. Silas Vane stood beside him, his briefcase open, looking like he was ready to litigate the end of the world. Across from them were my children. Seeing Penny and Julian in handcuffs was a different kind of pain than the one I'd felt at the wedding. That had been a sharp, sudden sting. This was a dull, echoing ache. They looked small. They looked like the children I used to pick up from detention. Except this time, the principal was a federal agent with a sidearm. Penny's hair was a bird's nest, and the mascara had stained her cheeks in long, dark streaks. Julian wouldn't look at me. He stared at the floor, his shoulders hunched as if he could disappear into the expensive carpet. And then there was Jax Blackwood. He didn't sit. He stood in the corner, leaning against a glass pillar, his leather duster unbuttoned. He was the only one in the room who looked comfortable. He was the predator who knew the cage was open. "We're all here, Arthur," Max Montgomery said, breaking the silence. He was sitting at the head of the conference table, acting as the unofficial moderator of this disaster. "The DA has granted a 2-hour window for this. Clarification. Let's not waste it." I walked to the table and laid the black moleskin notebook in the center. I didn't rush. I wanted them to feel every second of the silence. "This," I said, tapping the cover, "is the history of the Sterling-Miller merger. It's not the version you told the banks, Harrison. And it's not the version you told your father, Julian. It's the truth, written in your own hand." "It's a fabrication," Silas Vane barked, his voice cracking. "A desperate attempt by a man who realized his fraud was discovered." I didn't even look at him. I looked at Penny. "Did you know he was skimming, Penny? Or did you think the money for the Maldives just fell out of the sky?" Penny let out a jagged sob. "Dad, please." Alistair said it was part of the deal. He said we deserved it for having to deal with. With me? I finished for her. For having to hide the old man by the restroom so he didn't ruin the atmosphere? Arthur, let's get to the point. Harrison growled. You said you had the $4 million from the pension fund. If you have it, return it. We can settle the civil suits. We can make sure your children don't spend the next 20 years in a box. I smiled. It was a cold, thin thing. Oh, I don't have the money, Harrison. Not yet, but I know where it is. It's in a private account at the Bank of St. George in the Caymans. An account opened in my name. Harrison's eyes lit up with a predatory spark. Then you admit it. You're the one who stole it. No, I said, leaning over the table. I'm the one who's about to transfer it. You see, Julian was very clever. He used my digital signature and my thumbprint to open the account. He thought he was creating a fall guy. But what he actually did was give me the only set of keys to the vault. I pulled my laptop from my bag, the one Julian had secured for me. I opened it and turned the screen around. The login page for the offshore bank was already up. There it is, I said. $4 million. Enough to pay back the pension fund. Enough to keep the feds from digging into the rest of the Sterling accounts for another 6 months. The room held its breath. I could see the sweat on Harrison's upper lip. I could see Jax Blackwood's eyes narrow behind his shades. But here's the problem, I continued. As the educational policy consultant you all claimed I was, I've decided to implement a new curriculum, and the first lesson is about the cost of an identity. I looked at Harrison. You want this building, Harrison? You want the ground lease back? It'll cost you exactly $4 million. A private buyback of the shares Julian and Alistair issued to me. That's extortion, Vane shouted. No, Silas, that's a real estate transaction, Max Montgomery said smoothly, and quite a fair one, considering the market. But, I said, raising a finger, the money doesn't go to me, it goes to Jax Blackwood. Jax straightened up. The predatory smile vanished, replaced by a look of genuine surprise. Go on, Arthur. Jax, you're owed $10 million, I said. $4 million comes from Harrison today. That settles the Sterling portion of your debt. In exchange, you walk away from this building and everyone in it. No more threats to O'Malley Street. No more taking the house apart. And the other $6 million? Jax asked. I turned to Julian and Penny. That's where my children come in. They've been very busy investing your money, Jax. I found the ledger for the other accounts, the ones you didn't know about, the ones they were going to use to flee to Switzerland. Julian's head snapped up. Dad, no! Don't tell him! I've already sent the coordinates of those accounts to the SEC, Julian, I said, my voice as hard as granite. But I haven't sent the passwords. If you want to avoid a life sentence for money laundering and fleeing justice, you're going to authorize the transfer of those funds to Jax's holding company. Right now. They'll still go to jail, Arthur, Harrison sneered. You're just handing Blackwood the money and leaving your kids in the dirt. They're going to jail regardless, Harrison, I said. But there's a difference between 5 years for a first-time white-collar offense and 25 for conspiracy and grand larceny. If they pay Jax back, Jax doesn't have a reason to testify to the feds about the darker parts of their partnership. He just becomes another victim of the Sterling fraud. I looked at my son. It's your choice, Julian. Give Jax his money and take the 5 years. Or keep the money and I guarantee you'll never see the outside of a fence again. Julian looked at Jax Blackwood. Jax didn't say a word. He just tapped a heavy ring against the glass pillar. The sound was like a hammer on a coffin. I'll sign, Julian whispered. I'll sign too. Penny sobbed. Just make it stop, Dad. Please. There's one more thing, I said, closing the laptop halfway. The final part of the lesson. Harrison, you're going to sign a confession. Not for the feds. For the Boston Globe. A full, detailed account of how you groomed my children, how you coached them to steal from their mother's trust, and how you orchestrated the seating at the wedding to keep the poor teacher from seeing the books. I will do no such thing, Harrison spat. That would ruin the Sterling legacy forever. The legacy is already dead, Harrison, I said. Max has the documents for the second merger, the one you were using to cover the first. If you don't sign the confession, Max releases those to the SEC within the hour. You won't just be broke. You'll be the man who bankrupts every one of your old money friends who invested with you. They won't send you to jail. They'll make sure you disappear. Harrison looked at the room. He looked at his son, Alistair, who was staring at him with a mixture of hatred and hope. He looked at Max. And finally, he looked at me. He saw that I had nothing left to lose. I had already lost my children. I had already lost my peace. I was a man standing in the ruins of his own life, and I was perfectly comfortable in the wreckage. Harrison grabbed the pen. His hand was shaking so badly he had to use his other hand to steady it. He signed. As the federal agents began to lead them away, the Sterlings to one van, my children to another, the solarium felt suddenly, hauntingly empty. The high-altitude sun was still shining, but it felt cold. Max stood up and walked over to me. "You did it, Arthur. You saved the house, you saved the trust money, and you've effectively decapitated the Sterling Empire." I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a man who had just finished a very long, very painful surgery. "Max," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I want you to take the $4 million from the offshore account. Don't give it to the pension fund. Not yet." Max frowned. "Arthur," we agreed. "That's the leverage." "I know what I said," looking out at the harbor. "But I just realized something. Julian didn't just use my name for the account. He used the trust money to seed it, which means that $4 million doesn't belong to the Sterlings, and it doesn't belong to the bank. Who does it belong to?" I looked at the black notebook on the table. "It belongs to the educational policy consultant, and I think it's time he made one final, massive investment." I hadn't told Max the whole truth, not even close. There was a third set of books hidden in that garage, one that I hadn't shown anyone, one that proved that there was a silent partner even bigger than Jack's Blackwood, a partner who was currently sitting in a black SUV outside the building, waiting for me to come down. I didn't know it yet, but the reversal was only halfway complete. The Sterlings were gone, but the person who had really set this all in motion was finally stepping out of the shadows. "I have to go, Max," I said, picking up my bag. "Arthur, wait, who's in the car?" I didn't answer. I walked out of the glass solarium, through the empty offices, and down to the street. The black SUV was idling at the curb. The window rolled down halfway. I saw a pair of eyes that looked remarkably like mine, but colder, older. "Did they sign?" the woman asked. "They signed, Sarah," I said, my voice trembling. "Your sister and brother are on their way to jail." "Just like you wanted." Sarah Miller, the daughter I had told everyone was dead for the last 10 years, the one who had actually been the ghost in the machine the entire time, gave me a small, chilling smile. "Good," she said. "Now, let's go get the rest of our money." My heart stopped. I had spent the last 48 hours thinking I was the one seeking revenge. I didn't realize I was just the final piece in a game my eldest daughter had been playing for a decade. The door of the SUV clicked shut, sealing out the sounds of the sirens and the shouting reporters at the base of the Sterling building. Inside, the air was chilled to a precise, sterile temperature. Sarah didn't look at me as she pulled out into the midday traffic of the seaport. She drove with a calm, terrifying efficiency, her hands relaxed on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Dad," she said. Her voice was lower than I remembered, stripped of the youthful vibrance she'd had a decade ago. "I thought you were in London," I whispered, my voice sounding hollow in the plush cabin. "I thought you were. I thought you didn't want to be found. 10 years. 10 years since the night Sarah had vanished from O'Malley Street." Back then, Penny and Julian had come to me with proof, a series of bank statements and emails showing that Sarah had stolen $40,000 from my retirement fund and fled to Europe with a boyfriend I'd never met. I had been devastated. I had called her, emailed her, even hired a private investigator who found nothing but a dead end in a rainy flat in South London. Eventually, my other 2 children convinced me that she had died to the family. They told me to let her go, that her greed had outpaced her love. I sat there, watching the Boston skyline blur past, and the truth hit me with more force than the Sterling scandal ever could. Julian and Penny hadn't just used me as a fall guy, they had used Sarah as a prototype. They had practiced their betrayal on their own sister before they perfected it on their father. "They did it to you, didn't they?" I asked. "The 40,000, the boyfriend, it was all them." Sarah finally looked at me, a quick, sharp glance. "They didn't just take the money, Dad. They took my reputation. They told the police I was involved in a drug ring at the university. I had to disappear. If I stayed, I was going to prison for things Julian had done. I didn't go to London to hide from you. I went to London to survive them." She pulled the car into a quiet, shaded lot near the Arnold Arboretum. She turned off the engine and the silence rushed back in. "I've spent 10 years working for firms like Montgomery and Associates," she said, her eyes fixed on a family walking their dog through the park. "I became the best forensic auditor in the city because I needed to know how to find what they hid. When Alistair Sterling started looking for a rich father-in-law, I was the one who leaked your name through a series of shell companies. I lured them in, Dad. I gave them exactly what they wanted, a target. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. You used me, Sarah. You put me in that restroom hallway. You let them rob the trust. I let them think they were robbing it, Sarah corrected, her voice turning sharp. I was the one who told Jax Blackwood about the ledger. I was the one who made sure the SEC warrant was signed this morning. I didn't use you to get the money, Dad. I used you to get the confession. I needed Julian and Penny to admit what they did to me and to you in a room full of people who couldn't be bought. She reached into the back seat and pulled out a sleek, white tablet. She tapped the screen and handed it to me. It was a video feed of the Federal Processing Center. I saw Julian and Penny sitting on a metal bench, still in their wedding finery, looking utterly broken. They're going away for a long time, Sarah said, and for the first time, I heard a tremor of emotion in her voice. Not just for the Sterling fraud, but for what they did to our family. I've handed the DA the evidence from 10 years ago. The theft they blamed on me? It was Julian's gambling debts. I have the receipts now. I looked at the woman sitting next to me. She was brilliant, cold, and successful. She was everything Penny and Julian had pretended to be, but she was also a stranger. The little girl who used to help me plant tomatoes in the backyard was buried under layers of professional spite and long-distance trauma. Tile. Was it worth it? I asked. Destroying them? They destroyed themselves the moment they sat their father next to a toilet. Arthur, she said. She didn't call me Dad that time. I just provided the lighting so everyone could watch it happen. The resolution came not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, bureaucratic thuds. Over the next 6 months, the Sterling empire was picked apart by the feds like a carcass on the highway. Harrison Sterling avoided prison by turning over state's evidence against his own board of directors, but he ended up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Quincy. His old money reputation turned into a punchline at every country club in New England. Alistair was annulled from Penny within weeks, but he found himself blackballed from every financial institution in the country. Last I heard, he was selling used luxury cars in Florida, trying to maintain an atmosphere in a lot that smelled of hot asphalt and desperation. As for my children, the 5-year sentence I'd negotiated with Jax Blackwood held up for the white-collar charges, but the new evidence Sarah provided added another 4 years for the conspiracy and the identity theft of a decade prior. I visited them once. Just once. Julian looked older, his hair thinning, the Porsche confidence replaced by a hollow-eyed stare. Penny wouldn't stop talking about how unfair it all was, how they had only been trying to level the playing field. She still didn't get it. She still thought of life as a game where the only sin was losing. I loved you more than I loved myself, I told them through the plexiglass. And that was my mistake. I raised you to believe that the world owed you a seat at the head table, but I forgot to teach you that you have to be a person worth sitting next to. I walked out of that prison and I never went back. I didn't change my number, but I stopped answering the collect calls. The final twist, the one that really changed the atmosphere of my life, happened on a Tuesday morning in October. I was back at O'Malley Street. The rented furniture was gone. My old recliner was back in its spot, and Martha's photo was hanging in its rightful place over the radiator. I was sitting on the porch watching the neighborhood kids walk to school when a black car, not Sarah's SUV, but a modest sedan, pulled up. Max Montgomery stepped out. He looked tired, but he was smiling. He was carrying a thick, legal-sized envelope. "You're a hard man to track down, Arthur," Max said, joining me on the porch. "I'm not hiding, Max. I'm just living." He handed me the envelope. "The Sterling Miller acquisition's liquidation is complete. After the pension funds were repaid and the creditors were satisfied, there was a surplus. Because you were the primary guarantor and the managing member during the emergency reversion, the remaining assets belong to you." I opened the envelope. I expected a few $1,000s, maybe a final settlement for the house. I stared at the check. $8 million. "The tech merger didn't completely fail, Arthur," Max explained, leaning against the porch railing. "One of the patents, a clean water filtration system Julian thought was garbage, was bought out by a conglomerate in Germany. Since the shell company owned the patent, the royalties flooded in during the bankruptcy. It's all yours. The house, the trust, and then some." I looked at the number. 8 million. It was the castle Penny had promised me when she was 10. It was the private investment Julian had lied about. "What are you going to do with it?" Max asked. I looked at the house. I looked at the peeling paint and the cracked sidewalk. I thought about the 30 years of chalk dust and the thousands of students who had passed through my classroom. I'm going to change the seating chart, I said. I didn't buy a mansion in the Back Bay. I didn't buy a Porsche. I set up the Martha Miller Foundation. We bought the old shuttered community center at the end of the block and turned it into a vocational school and a nursing prep academy. I hired Sarah to run the financial side. She's still cold, and we're still learning how to be father and daughter again. But when we work together on the books, I see flashes of the girl she used to be. She's finding her way back, one honest transaction at a time. I still live on O'Malley Street. I still wear the same 3 coats. But every Sunday, the foundation hosts a dinner for the neighborhood. There are no assigned seats. There are no nobodies and somebodies. We sit at long communal tables, and if you're the janitor or the teacher, you get the same filet mignon as the guy who owns the bank. The moral of the story, I suppose, is something I should have taught Julian and Penny a long time ago. Wealth isn't what you have in the bank. It's what you're willing to leave behind for the people who come after you. My children tried to build a life on the shadows of other people, and they ended up in the dark. I chose to stay in the light of a Southie kitchen, and I ended up owning the building. One evening, Sarah sat with me on the porch. We were watching the lights of the new community center flicker on. "You know, Dad," she said, sipping a cup of tea. "Alistair's father called my office yesterday. He wanted a loan. He thought since I was a Miller, I might have some family loyalty." I laughed. It was a real deep laugh that felt like it cleared the last of the industrial bleach out of my lungs. "What did you tell him?" Sarah smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "I told him we had plenty of room for him at our next dinner, but I told him he'd have to sit by the restroom. I hear the atmosphere back there is very grounding." I looked out at the street. The foundation was strong, the house was quiet, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care where I was sitting. I was exactly where I belonged. If you enjoyed this journey of betrayal and redemption, what do you think was the turning point for Arthur? Was it the seat at the wedding, or the discovery of the hidden daughter?